Alright, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to talk about the Greek Dark Ages. This is going to be our first time period in Greece when we really get in depth about what was going on in this part of the world. There were other civilizations that were founded before the official start of the Greek Dark Ages in Greece, most notably the Minoan Civilization on Crete and the Mycenaean Civilization that took over after the Minoan Civilization. They built a bunch of cool stuff like dolphin mosaics, and they were equipped with bowls, which is probably where the legends of the Minotaur came from, and they built gold masks, which is probably where the legend of King Midas and how he turned everything into gold, and they made octopus jars, which is wait, there is no legend about octopi, is there? Well, we'll make one up, and that's where it came from. Anyway, we are going to start a little bit after that with the Greek Dark Ages, when everything was dark and sad and horrible and awful. Or was it? Yes, it was. So, this begs the question, if everything was so wonderful during the Mycenaean and Minoan time periods where you had animals and people who were literally the stuff of legends, why did Greece fall into the Dark Ages? Well, this is one of those things that historians aren't quite sure on, but we'll get back to later. And in the meantime, here are two very plausible theories. Either it was an invasion by some mysterious people from the north, probably those gosh darn pastoral nomads again, or a volcano went off and shut out the sun for a couple of years with ash, and all the crops failed and everybody died. So, Dark Ages throughout history have a lot of things in common, but what were the characteristics that particularly showed up during the Greek Dark Ages? Well, first of all, we see there was a low population, which lends some credence to the volcano theory where the crops were destroyed. That reduced food production because there were fewer people around to actually produce the food. That led to a mass migration to Ionia, that coast of Turkey, because people didn't necessarily want to live on the Greek mainland anymore. They want to go where there is better farmland. So those are all kind of the environmental social factors. Now let's look at what the government and the military looked like during the Greek Dark Ages. We think that most cities during the Greek Dark Ages were ruled by something called an oligarchy. That literally translates to a government by a few. A few people control the government. Those few people were probably wealthy from only a few families, so you had to be part of one of those families to be a member of the government. In other words, they were aristocrats. Wealthy people from a couple of families you got to be born into to be a member of that class. And then the people who were in those families would often fight a lot of wars. There were battles during the Greek Dark Ages and chaos in general. Now, those wars were a little bit different than the wars we're going to see later on in the Greek unit. They were mostly fought, again, by smaller armies filled with wealthy people, because you had to be wealthy enough to own a horse or a backup horse if something goes particularly wrong. The most famous explanation of Greek life in the Dark Ages comes from this epic poem called the Iliad. The Iliad is like the other epic poems we've seen so far. It involved heroes and gods controlling the fate of the heroes, and there's this long story arc where good is battling evil. The Iliad is a little bit different because, from what we know, the Iliad wasn't written down for a very, very long time. Instead, it was transmitted through oral history, people speaking and telling the story. So rather than the author of the Iliad, I should say rather that the speaker was probably this guy named Homer. We don't have that much evidence that this guy actually existed, but let's go with that because everybody pretty much agrees if there was a guy who did come up with this story, his name was Homer. So, here is the overall background of the Iliad. You guys don't have to take extensive notes on this, but we are going to read a section of the Iliad, so you want to be basically familiar with what happened in the story by the time we read that primary document. Alright, here's the basic story of the Iliad, and remember, you don't need to know all of the gritty little details. Overall, the Iliad is a story about a war between Troy, which is located here, and the Greek city-states, specifically this one called Mycenae, which was located here. So we'll put our cast of characters who are on the Troy team over here, and the cast of characters that are on the Mycenae team over here. So this war all starts out with, and there's a bunch of background information about the gods that I'm skipping. This guy named Paris, who is the prince of Troy, steals the wife of a Spartan king named Helen. Just to be clear, the wife is named Helen, not the king. Anyway, so the king of Sparta is like, that's not cool, man. You can't just go around stealing people's wives. And so he gets his brother involved, who's the king of Mycenae, and they gang up together and they go attack Troy. This war lasts for 10 years, which is a really, really, really long time for an ancient war. Most of it is a siege with the Greeks surrounding Troy, so it's both boring and deadly all at the same time. But what this war really comes down to is a fighting between the two main heroes for each side. Hector for the side of Troy, fighting Achilles, the side of the Greeks. No spoilers, you can read it yourself to find out who won, and Homer also spoke. Another book that was supposed to be a sequel to the Iliad called the Odyssey. It's really long too. It's pretty good. You can read that also. Oh, and throughout these books there's a bunch of stuff about the gods and how they impact fate and how humans can't escape their fate. So no spoilers, but also sort of spoilers. Okay, that's good from a literary perspective, but let's talk about what we're really interested in here as historians, and that is the question of whether or not the Iliad is historically accurate, or in other words, was Troy really a place, and was there actually a Trojan War? Now, for most of history, all historians and archaeologists would have said emphatically no. But then there was this guy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, whose name was Heinrich Schliemann, seen here as a freaking baller, who was like, hey, I actually think the story of the Trojan War might be true, and I'm going to go off and find Troy. And all of the other archaeologists laughed at him. So he put an ad in the newspaper for a wife, which he got. She's actually kind of hot, and then he covered her in the jewels from Troy because, spoiler alert, he found the city on the second day of the archaeological dig. That doesn't happen, guys, but it happened to him. So now we know that the story of Troy is actually maybe true because there was this city called Troy. And that's not enough evidence to say definitively, yes, the Trojan War actually happened, but we can say that it does make sense that the city of Troy and the Greek city-states would have wanted to go to war together. To explain why this is logical, we have to go back to the map. So I'm not saying that the justification for war with the prince in Paris and he kidnaps the wife and then they go to war over that is logical. That probably didn't happen. But we can look at the location of Troy right there by the Dardanelles, guarding the entrance to the Black Sea, and say, hey, the Greek city-states would have probably wanted that city because whoever has Troy holds the entrance to the Black Sea and all of those trade routes. So it would have been a very valuable city. We know that the Greek city-states traded a lot and depended on their harbors and importing grain from outside places, so it does make sense that the Greek city-states would have wanted to attack the city and take it as their own. If you control Troy, you can control the trade. And then finally, the Iliad could be historically accurate because it lines up with what we know about Dark Age warfare. Think about those two heroes, Hector and Achilles. They represent that kind of warfare that is fought by the nobility or the aristocracy, just the members of the upper class, where it's just a couple of people who are extremely well-trained professional soldiers in charge of representing their city to the rest of the population, and they are the ones who are going forward and actually fighting the battle. On the other hand, there are many things about the Iliad that probably could never line up with historical fact. For example, one of the things that Homer, if he's the guy who actually wrote this epic poem, said was that it took place during the time period of Mycenaean Greece. If we remember going back to our timeline, that would be slightly before the Dark Ages. However, everything we see about this story lines up with what we see during Greece during the Dark Ages, so even if it is true, it probably occurred during the Dark Ages, not Mycenaean Greece. And then the second thing that's probably not true about the Iliad is all of this stuff with the gods interfering in human fate. One of the things we'll see as the Greek civilization gets a little bit older is the first historians that start attributing human events to actual cause and effect relationships. Basically what we're doing in this class when we talk about how geographical features impacted the course of a civilization or why an empire fell. But Homer isn't quite there yet. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and get Greece out of the Dark Ages. Greece was able to recover from the Dark Ages through the use and development of two new inventions. The first was the Phonetic Alphabet, helping civilizations far and near like a linguistic superhero. Anyway, the Phonetic Alphabet, as we remember from our Mesopotamia and Egypt unit, was a lot easier to use because there are only 26 characters that you have to remember, meaning it's more efficient and more people can use it, which probably helped Greek trade, which probably helped them earn more money and import more grain so they could help feed the population again. Speaking of feeding the population, we also see the very first iron farming tools in Greece at the end of the Dark Ages, which probably increased the population and allowed governments to thrive once again.